So in our second installment of anti-rambles about conlagging and its consequences on human society, we've discovered that British are at fault of everything that is evil in the world. This week I'll present to you two things: that Russians are at fault of everything that is evil in the world, and the eternal questions without answers that are ultimately a matter of a number of factors, most of which you have no control over, also known as orthographies. Starting from basically the early 19th century, a peculiar phenomenon could be spotted in the boundless steppes and forests of then Little Russia. That is, the people who historically never considered themselves to be Russians, and weren't considered as Russians by Russians themselves, were starting to get passive-aggressive about them not being Russians. And one of the first signs of this passive-aggressiveness was that instead of writing in Russian, they started to write however the fuck they feel like. And during this early boom of Ukrainian literature, something truly horrible happened. An effectively Russian professor of Zaporozhian Cossack origin named Maksymovych published a book called Little Russian Folk Songs in his own orthography based on etymological principle. Now, for those of you who've slept through most of language courses in school, an etymological orthography is a system of spelling that is based on the historical tradition of the people, making what is written historically consistent, but not exactly the same as it's supposed to be pronounced. A phonetic orthography, in the meanwhile, is a system of writing based on the way people are pronouncing words at the time of creating the system, making what is written look pretty much exactly how it's supposed to be pronounced, but also completely devoid of historical roots to most people that couldn't be bothered to learn them. Returning to our story, Maksymovych published a book in his own system of writing based on what he considered to be accurate to the way Little Russians wrote in Ukrainian Rus from the times of Yaroslav the Wise, accusing people who used phonetic orthographies of writing in gibberish that is unfathomable to a common person, and that instead we should all write as close to the ways our ancestors did as possible. So obviously it fucking failed miserably, and pretty much everywhere but the Carpathian Mountains it was replaced with a phonetic orthography. The second one was readily available to the public, but you all know that already by now, simply by the fact Ukrainians aren't writing like that currently. The delicious failure of the system is a testament to how a lot of elements of the language are ultimately outside of our control. In the Russian Empire parts of current Ukraine, the growing Ukrainian movement was still in its infancy, but it already was showing the also Ukrainian moral characteristic of doing a lot of its daily activities simply out of spite. So when a mostly Russian-speaking academic proposed a writing system for his supposedly native Little Russian dialect he barely if ever used, that looked suspiciously like contemporary Russian but with additional scribbles about the letters, the reaction to it was entirely predictable. It had more traction in the Austro-Hungarian parts of Ukraine, however, there it was mostly used by the people who despised the idea of Ukrainian nationalism and wanted all Slavic peoples to be at best governed by Russians, at worst to abandon their culture and traditions and become Russians, as they were the superior breed of the Slavonic race. So the ultimate reaction of Ukrainian nationalists to it there was also entirely predictable. But the key word of this whole debacle to me is hubris. Maksymovych erroneously believed people outside of academic circles to know exactly the history of Ukrainian language and its phonetic changes, and the result of this was that many people who used this and even created school books with this exact orthography suffered from the simple issue of not knowing which Old Slavic sound turned into what in Ukrainian, resulting in basically sabotaging the whole teaching process until it was replaced by a simple to understand "write as you pronounce it, you dumb fucks." The question of etymological versus phonological orthography is a question often asked whenever someone wants to make an orthography reform. Even English has its fair share of absolutely phonetic proposals that ironically make English look like it was written by orcs from 40k. In many ways, this debate can be compared to the social question of conservatism versus progressivism. One is about defending and promoting the traditional social institutions and practices, regardless of the current social or economic realities or people's understanding of why those institutions and traditions existed in the first place. The other one is about ignoring traditions in favor of a social reform based on current understanding of science and current development, which may lead people to support some of the most heinous shit simply because some egghead in lab code wrote a funny book about it. However, like many questions in soft sciences, it is a question that will never have a definitive answer because it revolves around people, and people in general are dumb, lazy, and have a tendency to defy authorities by taking the path of least resistance. And the lesson here is that developing a functional orthography for a language is not actually very hard. The hard part is to make other people people use it, and that is something very few people can organically control, ethnic cleansing notwithstanding. Maksimovych's orthography ultimately came in a time when Ukrainian national movement was solidifying their disdain for their neighbors, thus making sure that the only people who were to support it are either people who hated Ukraine as an idea or people who hated change, which was simply not what majority of people desired for this fledgling new nation, and that is why they've chosen a morphological principle instead, because whenever Ukrainians aren't doing something out of spite, they try to appease everyone, resulting in tears of frustration, especially when you learn suffixes, which is especially hilarious when you realize that modern-day Ukrainians are resisting any sort of changes to the Ukrainian language. You know what they say? Progressive ideas of today are merely conservative ideas of tomorrow.